I was asked to talk today about how Phoenix Mountains Preservation Council, or PMPC from here on out, whom I represent as part of the Conservation Alliance, got involved with the land acquisition for all these mountain preserves, and a little bit including Camelback Mountain. That kind of started the whole thing. And when I said, oh sure, that's a great topic, I'll talk on that, what I didn't realize is that it's actually an enormous topic. It would be a great PhD thesis for someone. And I called up ASU Storage and I said, well, Dottie Gilbert was one of our founding members, and she's got some papers stored down there. And they said, oh yes, come on down, give us plenty of time. She's got 34 boxes. So for any of you that think that this Camelback Mountain and all of the North Phoenix Mountain Preserves was an easy process, it was actually a very, very lengthy and difficult one. Basically, preserves are come about because you've got a city or a state or a county. You've got non-paying or volunteer groups like Phoenix Mountains Preservation Council. They get very, very involved in selecting land and having it preserved. And then, of course, the third component is the voters who vote and spend a lot of money and want to have land preserved. Phoenix has a phenomenal history of preserves. We have South Mountain Park, which was well before PMPC's time, but that was in the early 1920s, and they bought the land from the federal government. I think the price was about $17,000, so it was quite a good investment. A quote from 1960, Phoenix Mountains Preservation Council was actually formally put together in 1970, and it was active, and some of its members were active through the late 60s. But a quote from an open space plan for the Phoenix Mountains, which I believe is a MAG document, says, as cities grow together into metropolitan complexes, people tend to lose identity with their community. Uneasiness, tension, and violence are becoming increasingly characteristic of urban life, even in Arizona. Unfortunately, still going on in Echo Canyon, apparently. So there was a groundswell of public opinion that was trending very strongly towards conservation of open space. And so, my history today, I hope not too dull, is how we got here to where we are today. And later on, a little bit about, if I have time, what could happen in the future. In the 50s, 275 acres of North Mountain had been bought by Maricopa County, and 388 acres of Squaw Peak was bought in 1958. These lands were transferred, and I couldn't find how, to the city of Phoenix by Maricopa County. During the 1950s, there was a great deal of development on Camelback Mountain. You could see the houses going up the hills. There was a very tight group of people that were very disturbed about the scars on the mountain, how ugly that looked. And with Barry Goldwater leading the charge, they were able to convince Galbraith, who owned the land on top of the mountain, to donate the top 340 acres of Camelback Mountain as a preserve. Later, the Echo Canyon trailhead was on land bought by the city, so perhaps they should have bought a little bit more. In the late 60s, Dottie Gilbert, who was a founding member of PMPC, had started writing letters to the then Governor Paul Fannin. She was actually a pretty well-known writer. She wrote for Time and Newsweek in the East Coast, and she and her husband had moved down here from there in the 60s. There were mining claims that they found done by BLM adjacent to Squaw Peak, and those were patented to the city of Phoenix in 1970. Discovery and exploratory study of the Phoenix Mountains open space was undertaken by the Phoenix Planning Department in 1963. They led to what was called the Open Space Resolution in 1966. However, there were conflicts between private property rights and the inherent right of the public to protect its natural environment. And the resolution went down. I don't know what happened to it. It's a lot of research to go into these things, but it didn't go forward. And it really became a question in that time of livability versus economic viability of our city. there was enormous pressure, even in the 60s, for the mountain slopes to become developable land because everybody knew that houses on the mountain would bring more money. Example, Camelback already. The city kept on going. That's the city of Phoenix. It led to an open space plan. The mountains being such a feature of Valley's landscape, and conservation of these features before it was too late became a PMPC and a Valley-wide issue. And I quote from that: "The surrounding mountain slopes form a dramatic backdrop to every vista within the city." And it was becoming increasingly clear that open space, if retained, would enhance the present and potential value of surrounding urban development and would conserve significant natural, historical, and man-made resources. It would enhance the community identity, and that's certainly very strong today. So in 1966, the city of Phoenix passed an open space plan for the Phoenix Mountains. And in it was written, "It's essential that the project be motivated by the cities and undertaken as a community project." This plan proposed that the Phoenix Mountains be preserved as open space with scenic parkways and drives, hiking and riding trails, and several recreation complexes. It's obviously evolved since then. The plan was devised with the basic underlying concept of preserving the entire undeveloped portion of the Phoenix Mountains as a second wilderness park within the city, the first being South Mountain. So the first meeting of PMPC, the first official meeting, was 1970. Phoenix's population in 1970 was right around 700,000. There was a lot of land around the Squaw Peak area under pressure from two different development syndicates. One was Lyons Realty and the other from a syndicate from Chicago. So PMPC at that time approached the Nature Conservancy to purchase the North Mountains. Dottie, of course, was still pushing for the unique wilderness park. Needless to say, we know that the Nature Conservancy did not come through with anything. So when Charles Christensen arrived in Phoenix, Charles Christensen eventually became director of the Parks Department, Dottie and Pearl Charles, among others, took Christensen for a horseback ride in the Phoenix Mountains at Squaw Peak and spoke to him of their dream of staving the land. And I quote from Dottie's notes: "Struck by the pristine landscape and realizing that developers were also enjoying it, Christensen talked the city council into hiring a consultant to recommend what land should be included in a preserve. And this was the Van Cleve report, so any of you are interested in it, that's a really interesting one. Covered 14,000 acres of the Phoenix Mountains range, and his recommendation was to save 9,000 acres of it. In the 1970s, Dottie Gilbert, Margaret Hance, she was not a member of PMPC, but she certainly came to meetings. She's recorded in the minutes. Ruth Hamilton, Maxine Lakin, and others convinced Mayor Driggs to preserve the Phoenix Mountain Range in what is now the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. So in MAG, it is written, and in their open space plan, that a local example, this is a quote, "A local example of an organized space management effort is the Phoenix Mountains Preserve with over 26,000 acres. The effort to that includes South Mountain. The effort to protect the mountainous terrain began in the early 1970s with a grassroots campaign that was motivated by scars created by roads and residential development on the mountain slopes. Another motivating factor was the potential loss of public access to these areas. This was PMPC. In 1971, citizen pressure on the city council advanced by PMPC was so great that they put a moratorium on all buildings not previously approved on the 15 square miles of the North Mountain area. That was to await a master plan preserving the mountains as a wilderness park within the city. Mayor Driggs was able to put together a coalition which backed a $23.5 million bond election, and it was passed by the citizens of Phoenix in May of 1974 for mountain preserve acquisition. The public voted to expand the preserves by 10,500 acres and in the North Mountains and 2,500 acres in the South Mountains. Left undeveloped, the land will be a priceless asset to a growing community. Total costs were split between a bond election and general city funds. However, there was some sort of a recession in the mid-1970s, and the city did not come up with their part of the funds. I'm not even sure how much of all those funds they put together, but anyway, it kind of fell apart. And in May of 1977, in a letter to the editor of the Republic, a PMPC member wrote, "The money from the bond issue has been spent. The council has reneged their $13.5 million not contributed, and there is no integrity to the preserve." This resulted in a change to the state constitution, also pushed by PMPC members in 34 boxes of notes and other things, to allow for greater bonding capacity for parks, recreation, and open space. And that did go through. Examples of where PMPC were able to affect all sorts of change, but they were not always successful. There was something called the Paradise Valley Access Relief Road. I hope someone knows what that is, but I think it's what is now Dreamy Draw Drive. But there was a member that went through hiking in Squaw Peak in what was supposed to be preserved land, and there were all these stakes going through the mountains. So he asked what was going on, and they said, "It's a water line." And then a few days later, someone else said, "Oh no, it's a road." And actually there was a road planned there. So what he did, and his name was Don Kunst, what he did was he went down to city council meetings and warned that public meetings needed to be held before construction was to begin. And these public meetings did go on, and the road was delayed for many, many years. Nevertheless, it's there now. But the Pulliam family and the Arizona Republican and the Gazette were always very strongly behind the Mountain Preserve acquisition. It was one of their things, and that actually did make the front page of the Arizona Republic. Another example would be Tally Industries. They owned the land north of Lincoln at Squaw Peak. And Dottie Gilbert and PMPC really, really, really wanted that land put into the Mountain Preserve. And in fact, the city Parks Department also thought that would be grand. But what happened? So they approached Tally, and Tally had 3 stories of development, tennis courts, clubhouses, very dense development planned to go in there. And they asked him to just give the land over for greater density on the south side of Lincoln. What happened was that Tally had bought a company, I think it was called West Clock, but West Clock had bought clocks at that time from China, which were dodgy clocks, so he couldn't sell them, so they'd lost a lot of money on their West Clock subsidiary. They did not have the money to donate that land to the city of Phoenix, but the city of Phoenix was able to utilize the Hillside Ordinance, which is part of the zoning ordinance for the city of Phoenix, to restrict the zoning. So it's there, there's development there now, but it was a bloodbath and it went on for a long time. And you can read about it if you wish to. This is a really tight synopsis of what I've been through in the last couple of weeks. Save Our Mountains Foundation, which by the way is the contracting partner for North Mountain Visitor Center for this one with the City of Phoenix. Save Our Mountains was set up by PMPC in the early 1970s as a 501c3 so that people could donate to that for land acquisition. And it's quite extraordinary to read that, was it Reg Manning, a very famous cartoonist at the time, had done a cartoon for free to go on a certificate to give to people that had donated to the preserves. High schools and schools and local citizens worked pretty hard on bake sales and stuff, but and contributed to Save Our Mountains Foundation from that time. 1975, which I think I've already said was when they had a bit of a recession going on. I didn't live in America at that time, but they had to reduce the required boundary for the preserves. There was about $700,000 that was taken from preserve land acquisition budget, and although PMPC made sort of major efforts at city council meetings and they wrote to newspapers and everybody they could think of, that was like a very low period. Margaret Hance became mayor in 76. She ruled until 1983. And she actually did manage a $12.3 million bond election, which was enabling acquisition of more preserved land. In August '81, PMPC was the recipient of a certificate of appreciation from the government's Commission on Arizona Environment. And they wrote, in PMPC's inception in 1970, PMPC's pursuit has resulted in the assembly of over 7,000 acres of unique wilderness park and the leased Squaw Peak Park of 546 acres. In addition, PMPC has added more than 1,000 acres to South Mountain Park. Battling the vagaries of the political winds, the council members served on commissions, attended numerous zoning hearings, public hearings, and city council meetings, supported political candidates in sympathy with the cause, and submitted many recommendations for action. So you can see there were like constant and ongoing efforts by the development community to turn the preserves back to the public. They wanted to be able to build houses on that land, and the pressure's off now, and I'll explain why, but at that time it was very intense, political pressure, and PMPC rose up and opposed diligently these efforts for years. 1985, am I going too long? 1985 marked the inclusion of Chapter 26 in the Phoenix Charter. PMPC was also very, very involved with that. In fact, one of our early members drafted part of that. There had been a great deal of speculation by the city and others as to the validity of the preserved boundaries. What's preserved for real? And because the parks had acquired this land piecemeal a lot of the time, it was pretty unclear for a very long time. So although Chapter 26 was written to protect the preserves and to make sure that without a vote of the people, no one could develop in them, it became pretty apparent into the 90s that no one really was supporting that. And in fact, there were some pretty ugly situations coming up and some really tricky legal questions. For example, in South Mountain, you'll see the towers on top of the mountain. It was the land under the towers who owned that. If the towers were owned by a company who owned the land, could they put fiber optic cable up to them? There were all sorts of questions on that. And we had members still involved with PMPC today who were very involved in the Washington School District, who wanted to build 2 schools on land that was supposed to be preserves. And the city staff came in with their lawyers and said, well, we don't know what happened there. So although Del Sappinen was the guy at the city of Phoenix who had been very involved with that and said, no, it's definitely preserved land, no one was sure. And so in the end, we actually were able to resolve that by forcing a survey of the preserved boundaries. Do you have time for them? Do you want me to keep going? It's 1:05. Well, there was a Gosnell golf course, and that is in South Mountain. And one of our earliest members, you can say, please be quiet, and I'll sit down, honest. Ruth, because you're smiling there. Ruth Hamilton was one of our founding members, and some of you may remember Ruth. She was a pretty well-known woman around here. No one messed with Ruth, I can assure you. And she filed suit with several other people against Gosnell, because what Gosnell wanted to do, Gosnell wanted to trade flat land, his hillside land, for better flat land for his golf course. The city said that it had been grandfathered in before Chapter 26, and this case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Arizona, and PMPC actually lost that. And they did build their golf course. It's there today. But it was a bit of a precedent, and everyone was kind of aware that, well, you know, we've got to watch what happens with our preserves because they're not as safe as we think they are. Where we sit here today, the Thunderbirds wanted to build their Thunderbird golf course? TPC was to be here. On the west side of North Mountain, there were going to be bleachers so that everyone could watch the golf going on. They were proposing to obliterate 3 miles of Trail 100. And that battle was also quite a war. We actually won that one. And what happened was a trade was made, or a compromise, in that Gosnell was allowed to then build their golf course here of Thunderbird. It's on the north side of Thunderbird and on the east side of 7th Street. It did not become the TPC, I guess not quite as dramatic as being in these mountains. And it was built with a stipulation, or allowed with a stipulation, that if the golf course was ever to cease to exist, that land would go back into the preserve system. So there was somewhat of a compromise. 1998 marked the acceptance of the Phoenix Council, and I'm really ripping through this history because it's really lengthy, but anyway, of the Sonoran Preserve Master Plan. I actually sat on the first initial Sonoran Master Plan Committee, which was 1989. So the planning process for that, with thousands of committees, well, several committees and thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of man-hours of volunteer time went into what is now being acquired as the Sonoran Preserve in the North Phoenix area. It would be kind of nice if people went there instead of Kenya. All of these efforts, and especially the last one, the Sonoran Master Plan, was in the light of the enormously fast population of Phoenix. It was 700,000 in 1970. By 1990, it was 2.1 million. As of last year, it was 3.8 million. So we're rapidly growing, and we need more preserved lands. And we're now acquiring the Sonoran Preserve in the North Phoenix area very successfully. As of today, probably PMPC's greatest issue, other than trying to get more park people to help in the preserves and maintain them, because they are being loved to death, is the 202 issue. And the freeway, the South Mountain Freeway, and the 202 portion of it goes over the southwest ridges of South Mountain. It actually involves a taking of about 30 to 40 acres of Phoenix Mountain Preserve land. The state claims that it was grandfathered in before Chapter 26, and therefore they're allowed to do that. But I also, as much as I love development, I am an architect by training. As much as I abhor the thought of cutting 100 feet into those southwest ridges, I have to wonder about the common sense of a group of engineers at ADOT who think this is a good idea. PMPC is strongly opposed to it, and I think that we are trying, as part of the Conservation Alliance, to promote Phoenix as a hiking, biking, outdoor city. It's certainly magnificently beautiful, and 8 months of the year are perfection. Why would you put your precedence into a freeway going through a mountain range that supports, by some claims, 600 to 1 million visitors a year? It just doesn't make any sense. So we certainly have been fighting that issue since 1980-something, when it started. It isn't like ADOT had just come up with this great idea to chop off the mountain. They've been thinking about it a long time, and we've been really, really, really vocal about it all the way along, and we continue to be very dramatic about that. So, having gone through that, I then put my mind to think for 1 minute about the Conservation Alliance. And I won't talk about the future, but the Conservation Alliance is a great idea. We have the state, we have county parks, we have city parks, we have Audubon, we have the Desert Botanical Gardens who have headed it up with Kim, we have PMPC, we have some pretty important entities within the city of Phoenix that are preserve related. Stacy Butte, who's off having a baby, came up with a citizen science project. So under the thesis that we should let science lead us, we're doing this beautiful plant inventory here. I would think that if there's any way to expand that concept to other areas of the preserves, that would be great. In all of these books, that's one, in all of these books that you read, or these papers that you go through when you start thinking about land acquisition from the preserve, from the very, very beginning times, everybody has always talked about connectivity of the preserves. The ability to go from here to Lookout Mountain on a trail rather than on a road. And it's such a great idea, and Kim has put this coalition together. And what would be wonderful would be if we could come together and even just sitting down with maps, talk about how the connectivity can go right through the city, so that in fact, when we talk about promoting the preserves as part of our concept, that perhaps we can promote this connectivity where you can ride bikes through preserves, or children can go to school from their homes on a wash, and so on. It's an enormous idea with an enormous amount of work involved, because we don't even know what a viable wash is as of today. We don't know how wide it needs to be to take bicyclists and horse riders and children to school along a wash. We don't even know if it's safe to do that or not, but is it 60 feet or is it 30 feet, or we don't know. But it would sure be nice to know that. So we have the idea of a baseline for the preserves of flora and fauna, and we've started here at North Mountain with this wonderful flora project. We'd like to do more of that in the future, and perhaps it's not under the conservation lines, perhaps it's just everybody getting together. So there are some of the thoughts that we've had, and thank you for putting up